I like to take my audience through the different levels of understanding, what is a personality, what makes an individual, what are the masks that we wear, what is the underlying motives that are contributing to deeper patterns of behavior that are helping to create our experiences, right? Because you're going for certain things in life, or you're choosing what to focus on and what not to focus on. Because our brains are little deletion machines. So if you are sad and unhappy all the time, it can be a complex thing in many different contributing factors. But ultimately, happiness or joy is a choice in the moment. And a lot of it is just reframing what it is you're experiencing in that moment. Because if you are sad and unhappy, you're deleting all the reasons why you could be happy. If you're happy, you're deleting all the reasons why you can be sad. Because all that stuff exists all the time. It's just a matter of like, what are you looking for? Or what are you looking at? Where's your attention going? What are you paying attention to? Because where your focus goes, energy flows. You're putting energy into that. You're breathing life into it because you are deleting all the other stuff when you focus on something. Concentration, right? It's a superpower, essentially. So when we focus on our own growth and we focus on our patterns and we focus on ourselves, and some people are afraid of being selfish. But as I saw in some thumbnail of somebody else's video, their title was, "You have to be selfish first to be selfless." And I totally agree with that now. At first, when I was younger, I had a problem with that. I wanted to be altruistic and mutualistic and contribute to the well-being of other people. Ultimately, we all do deep down. If you kind of dig far enough, we have these things called mirror neurons. So if you see somebody else suffering, unless you're like blocking that shit out, you can feel what they're feeling. You can step in their shoes depending on your level of empathy that you allow for yourself to step into their shoes. But when I see somebody hug somebody else, oxytocin is not only released in their brains, but it's also released in mine. So I am vicariously living out an experience just by viewing somebody else's experience. That's how connected we all are. Understanding all of this stuff, we can start to understand how the outside world influences us, but also how our internal temperature or world influences us as well, in terms of what we focus on. Once again, we're putting energy into that stuff. Now, we might have emotional blocks, or we, try to be really stoic and somewhere in the middle, and we don't have a roller coaster of emotions. We're kind of just always, I'm just stoic. I'm indifferent. Nothing affects me. That's a choice as well. But you won't have these highs and these lows. You'll stay in the middle somewhere a lot of the times, unless, this really big life storm comes and uproots you. How does this all plug in to something tangible that matters that we can use? I mean, I use all this stuff every day. It's intangible, but it is what I use to create my experiences because I understand focus and concentration and consciousness. And that the more you expand your awareness on these things, the more you can see the patterns at work. So then you can interrupt them. First, you have to recognize them, then you can interrupt them, and then you can create the ones that you want to start getting better results because these patterns are leading to results. So, who are you, right? That's a very bland general question, but ultimately, is it everything that you've ever been exposed to and experienced and been told throughout your entire life that you adapted to over time because you processed that information in your mind, right? Like what this means, what's available to me, am I loved, do I matter? Question, things like that, right? And a lot of times we aren't even aware that that's what's happening, but ultimately that's kind of what we're feeling. And when we feel good, we're, you know, having our needs fulfilled. When we feel bad, we're probably not having our needs fulfilled, or we're deleting all the reasons why we could be happy. So, the analogy here that I picked up, I believe it's from Tony Robbins first, was the highway of gratitude. So a lot of people, if you're negative and bitter, and over time you became that because you focused on, all the problems in the world, and that's all you focused on. So you fired and wired those circuits in your brain to where you adapted to thinking that way because you got really good at it for doing it so many times. You did the reps. So you conditioned yourself psychologically. You have a highway of negativity that you use to commute to every day when you wake up. Your brain's just really good at focusing on all the negative things. So over time, you become bitter because you've been psychologically conditioned to think through that lens, to see life through that lens. And you're really good at deleting all the other reasons to be grateful, which would be the opposite of bitter, right? So you have a highway, so to speak, that you built up over time. Because a lot of this stuff happens over time. It's not really like a switch. So when we, notice that pattern, we can interrupt it and we can start to create the one we want, which is the polar opposite, would be gratitude. So, at first I started to do this. I kind of had a dirt path of gratitude. And as I continued to remind myself to be grateful and to focus on things to be grateful for in my day to day experiences, I turned that dirt path into a gravel path of gratitude. And slowly over time, it was paved with asphalt. And these are just using this analogy, but this is to give you a visual aid of what happens in our mind, because this is such an intangible thing, even though it is actually happening in your brain. Like, you are having physical changes in your brain when you do this stuff. You build your dirt path of gratitude or being grateful into a highway of gratuity. You still have that highway of negativity, right? Because your brain has adapted and conditioned to think that way. But now you also have this highway of gratitude. And here's the thing about, like, if you don't use it, you lose it. It begins to atrophy, just like a muscle. If you don't use your arm, like, let's say if I didn't use my left arm for like a year, I would lose a lot of muscle in my left arm. It would atrophy. Similar things happen in your brain. Those connections we do have like muscle memory, so those connections are always going to be there because you have fired and wired them, but they're not as strong because you're not reinforcing them by using them all the time. So when you reinforce this, looking at life through this lens of gratitude, and this is basically neuroplasticity is what we're talking about, is the term. What's going to happen when you understand that you can flip these patterns on their head of, like, for example, I gave you as bitter to grateful, you start to feel differently, you start to behave differently, act differently, and your character starts to shift where you have a more humble, grateful disposition. So then people will notice this and be like, you've changed, something happened, right? Like, you seem like you're glowing now. You just seem happier. People like to be around you more because they're vicariously experiencing that gratitude through you as well, through mirror neurons in our brain, where it's kind of a reflection back. Like, if you see a happy person or see somebody smiling, a lot of times we smile as well, right? Or if somebody has a really infectious laugh, we start laughing as well, or a yawn, things like that. We're all very connected. And it's extremely useful to understand this, the patterns in life and what lens you're choosing to look through, because it is a choice ultimately, and that's what autonomy is when you understand that it's a choice. Because a lot of times, if you're just going with your program that you've downloaded through your experiences when you were a child up into adulthood and you never question these things, you kind of just downloaded your computer program, so to speak. I use the analogy of the computer because you can program a computer and then it executes actions when you just hit a button. It's similar to us. We have these cues and these habits that we develop, and they can be very difficult to break if we don't understand how those habits were created in the first place. So getting to the root of this stuff and peeling back the layers, you can begin to understand why you do what you do and why you feel the way you feel, why you have the character that you have. It is moldable. You can change. As Alan Watts says, you are by no means obligated to be the person you were 5 minutes before. So it's like, well, how do we do it? What does that even mean? How do you do that? And that's uncovering the patterns. So you recognize the patterns, you interrupt them, and then you start creating the patterns that you want. And you will become that character over time. It's kind of like a video game where you're role playing. You can choose the role that you play. And why is this important? Because actions create results. You get feedback from these results, right, of what you're choosing to do. So you can begin to optimize. You can mitigate damage in life. You can mitigate, you can avoid problems. I mean, the problems are always going to arise and present themselves to you, and those are great opportunities, but you can avoid pitfalls a lot easier. You can save a lot of time by learning through these experiences and understanding the patterns. Be like, oh, that pattern led me to this poor result. I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to change this pattern of behavior. I'm going to change this way of thinking because it's leading me into this poor mentality and getting me a really poor result. And I want better results for myself and my family and anybody that I come across. I want to be a blessing to the world. And I want better results for myself, so I'm not feeling a certain way all the time, like anxious or depressed, for example. Those are all patterns. I can tell you this because I was depressed for like 10 years. I was very apathetic. I didn't realize, I called it stoic. I thought I was being stoic. But ultimately, I was hiding away from the storms of life and hiding away from my problems and checking out all the time and getting my dopamine fix somewhere else to feel like I was getting somewhere. But when I looked back on those 10 years, I realized I hadn't really gone anywhere. I was just spinning my wheels. So recognizing that pattern, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. It doesn't have to be a certain way, right? We can choose the direction, the trajectory of our life, the path we want to take. It's a choice. So I want to form a podcast around this. I want to talk about this. I want to invite other people on my podcast to have conversations around this and have specific examples of their own stories, because we all have a story that is basically fits within this narrative of patterns in life. We're all living out patterns. It's a very interesting, beautiful thing. And when we begin to peel back these layers, we begin to see how creative we are as beings, human beings, and how much of a sandbox it is that we're playing in here. You begin to move from scarcity to abundance. You begin to see how the universe is actually, neutral for the most part, but it's like if you give, it gives. If you take, it takes. That kind of thing. Like how you show up is how it's going to show up. It's going to match and mirror you, just like we match and mirror people that we see for the most part in terms of what we experience on a neurological level. Mirror neurons, once again. We're all very connected. So, hey, if this is something that's interesting to you and something you want to explore more, then yeah, stay tuned because I am going to wrap my podcast around these topics. And I guess essentially it's, what are the topics here? I just wrote it down. Because it is a little fringe. It's not the most common thing, right? You don't really bridge these gaps so much. There are people doing this, but I don't see it very often. But it's growth mindset, neuroplasticity, and spirituality. So psychology, spirituality, and philosophy, essentially. It's kind of what I'm bringing in here. There's a lot of biology as well. And combining these topics to bridge the gap between science and spirit, because that can be a very polarizing thing. It doesn't have to be. I mean, polarity is an interesting topic we'll get into. So this stuff can help change your life. It can help get you whatever results you want. It has you realize how creative you are. So if you want to make more money, this can help you with that. If you want to have better relationships, this can help you with that. If you want freedom, feelings of freedom, if you want to build a skill, whatever skill it is, you want to be better at something, this helps with that. This is pretty much the way to do that. And I've done it myself. I've seen other people do it. I've learned from mentors. I've been blessed to have many great mentors in my life. And a lot of this stuff can be found in certain books as well. So yeah, stick around and stay tuned. And we're going to have a wild ride. It's going to be a very fascinating journey, as it already is. So thanks for listening.